Thanks everybody for coming. I'm just here to make sure that no fights break out. My experience in the legislature prepared me to stop any fights that break out. And I really appreciate your work, John, the Conservation Commission, breathing real, new life into it, or just life into it of a certain sort, making people think about what conservation means in an age of climate warming. And when you think of conservation in a kind of traditional way, you think that the point of conservation is to preserve, to keep things the same, especially to preserve what we think of as the non-human world in the face of encroachments by human development and commercial development, and to fence something off and call it wilderness, a wilderness area, and let it be the same forever. Or maybe conservation is about bringing things back to the state that they were in before human intervention, to regrow something like what was a virgin forest, to make things go back to their original state. Conservation, but what can conservation mean in a time when the species that were once growing in a place or that once populated a forest can't survive any longer there because of climate warming? Conservation can't mean what it used to mean. And so to conserve means maybe to adapt and actually to intervene, to let humans intervene in a way to help the ecosystem adapt to climate warming. This is actually quite radically different understanding of conservation than the understanding that's been around since 1963 when the federal government passed the Wilderness Preservation Act. And so we have to bend our minds and open our minds to a new way of thinking, not just about how to interact with nature, but also what it means to preserve and to conserve, how to tune ourselves to the natural world. And in particular, tonight, we're going to try to help rethink what it means to tune ourselves to our forests, and to help us do that, we have these two real experts. Peter Clark, who comes to us from the University of Vermont and the Rubenstein School of Natural Resources. Peter Clark is a real scientist, something that I'm in a political science department. And, as they say, if you have to call your subject a science, then it's not one. So, but I appreciate being called a chemist for that reason. So a real scientist, and for that reason, among others, we really admire you, who studies forest regeneration, forest adaptation. A scientist, though, whose work is very directly informed by natural resource practitioners and their work, such as the work of Kevin Evans, who's the director of woodlands for Dartmouth College, which perhaps might be the very coolest job in the entirety of Dartmouth College. And overseeing 40,000 acres of Dartmouth woodland, which he's been doing for 20 plus years. And in that capacity, I suspect to do a little bit of everything, including facilitating research by students and faculty, and keeping Dartmouth's green certification updated, making sure that Dartmouth is complying, monitoring wildlife, and also thinking very carefully about what it means, what Dartmouth's responsibility is to the ecosystem that it is charged with stewarding. So we're really very, very delighted to have, and you live up north. Some people think of Hanover as up north, but you live in the real north. So we appreciate that you both made this drive and interrupted your whole routines to join us this evening and share with us what you know. So let me invite first Peter up to talk with us a little bit. I'm sorry if I just stole your notes, Peter. Here they are.
Well, I appreciate the very kind introduction, and it's always a pleasure to be presenting alongside my dear friend Kevin. Kevin and I have known each other for a number of years, but I've been exploring the lands that he's stewarded for almost 30, and so I couldn't be just to be able to continue to talk about this work and to continue this science engagement relationship has been great. And Russ, that was a really kind introduction. And I think you did a really nice job of framing where this idea of how conservation plays into decisions that we're making, and really the topic that we talk about today, this idea of assisted migration, which kind of edges up on, can bring make some hairs raised as you think about can we use the movement of species around as a potential conservation or adaptation tool, given some complexities that we're running up against. So today we'll be talking about this idea of assisted migration in forestry. I'll start by giving a bit of a higher level overview, some of the thinking, maybe the theoretical aspects of it. And then I'll pass the mic off to Kevin, and Kevin will give a bit of a deeper dive, think about what does this mean to actually practice on the ground? What are the challenges and opportunities? So just to set the stage and start to think about where we're at. Okay, it says Vermont's forest. We're looking at where I'm coming from in Vermont, but there are a number of factors that are facing the stewardship and maintenance of our forests into the future in the Northeast. It's not just a warming climate, but we are seeing extreme climate events. The Northeast is the heavyweight champion of invasive pests and pathogens, emerald ash borer, there's other insects that are afflicting trees. In our southern reaches, predation dynamics from deer and moose and other animals that are consuming all of our young seedlings. So there's really a lot of factors that are overlaid on top of an already pretty simple forest. You know, remember over almost 100 years ago, we have much of our forest and land was pasture. So these are relatively simple landscapes that are now being faced with many challenges. So foresters like Kevin and others are really thinking about managing for multiple outcomes in the face of a changing world. And so one of the tools that we think about, you can think of assisted migration as a potential tool for adaptation, is how tree planting can be used as a potential tool to address many of these strategies. And so there's really quite a bit of emphasis on this idea of tree planting. Folks have highlighted the potential carbon mitigation potential. Can we plant more of our forest and grow more trees to sequester more of that carbon? There's also this idea of restoring species, so species that have maybe been degraded and we're having trouble regenerating them, or can we potentially replace species that we're losing? Ash, hemlock, species that are really afflicted by pests and pathogens and maybe extirpated. And then really today we'll be talking about this idea of assisted migration. As climate warms, can we make our forests a bit more adaptive by potentially moving new seeds, southerly seeds or species into this area? And so just to set the stage and get this framing, what we recognize is that plant dispersal rates, natural rates of dispersal, are far lagging behind the rate in which climate is changing. So this is data from the past Holocene, last ice age. What we know is that southern New England is much of the spruce fir forest, and then over the course of 10 to 14,000 years, we move into the forest types that we see today with a bit more of a mix of oak and hickory. And what we see is that dispersal rates of plants moving northward was around 1/10 to around 1/3 of a mile annually. Comparing that to the rate in which climate is changing, we're looking at around 4 to 6 miles of warming every single year. So really the takeaway here is that climate change is far exceeding the ability for plants to be able to naturally migrate north. And so what we see based on various computer models is that we can generally say that for some species, and here we're just picking on sugar maple because it's an iconic species, we generally see declines in projected sugar maple habitat in the future, so this is 100 years into the future, and then potential increases in some species. Here we're looking at red oak. So you can call them winners or losers, but you can see that I call these projected future shifts in habitat. The reason why I say this is projected, this is a pretty coarse scale map, and so there may be pockets of refugia where some species tend to do better than others. But really the main takeaway is that there are challenges that are facing certain species. And as we think about where are those species going to go, the overstory canopy isn't going to pack their bags and start migrating away. Those trees are going to stick around. And so it's really that secondary layer, the seedling layer, the regeneration layer that'll really start seeing challenges in establishing the new forests of the future. And what we see in forestry, we often talk about shade tolerance, the ability for a seedling or a species to grow in deeper shade. And what we're seeing is that a lot of our future adapted species really require a lot of light to be able to establish. And so these seeds aren't going to migrate north and land in an undisturbed forest and a dark canopy. They really need an opening to be able to establish. And so this further compounds, we can have models that say that we'll have future habitat, but actually allowing those seedlings to establish will be a bit of a challenge without active intervention. And so these are, so if Hanover is thinking about coping with climate change and thinking about where they could potentially source seeds from, under a low emission scenario for the next 50 to 100 years, we may need to start looking to southern New England, even parts of New York, and then under a high emission scenario, looking to gather seeds to plant in Hanover, New Hampshire, all the way down in the mid-Atlantic region. So we're really starting to talk about pretty dramatic shifts in terms of where those potential seeds may need to be collected from to grow future forests of Hanover. And so zooming out, this really brings us to this idea of can we move and should we be moving species, seeds around to be able to adapt to our forests. So assisted migration is essentially the deliberate movement of plants or animals into a different habitat, and really framing this within the context of climate change. And so this is a topic that's been hotly debated over the last 20 years. There are positive framings around assisted migration. This may be for the biodiversity and protection, potential restoration of ecosystems, promoting various ecosystem services, so maintaining that forest as is, even though it may be in a different state, or even the preservation of rare species, so a species that may be losing its habitat and moving that into a new area. Now, of course, this brings up some concerns around invasions, risks, other unforeseen consequences, blunders. There's some examples here of my favorite, the cane toad. So we're talking about will we be introducing some sort of interactions or some species that may potentially overtake our ecosystem. I think it's the message here is that the devil's really in the details. Assisted migration really comes in various food groups. It's not just one all. And so what I'll take a moment to do is walk through these different food groups and try to understand how assisted migration can play out along a bit of a continuum. And so the first example here we call assisted population enrichment. And so each of these rectangles represents the native range that a plant may grow in. That may be white pine that grows from the mid-Atlantic and points to the south all the way up to points in Canada. And so within that range, we may be taking a source from the middle of its range and moving it a little bit more north. So it's still within that parent range of where that plant would grow, but maybe using a southern seed source to augment that. So the definition we have here is the movement of species or genotypes relatively short distances with expansion occurring contiguously within that current distribution. And this is actually something we've been doing in forestry, especially in plantation forestry in the South for quite a while, moving wet tolerant pines around, disease-resistant pines around within their range, but without huge, large movements. And so we do have some evidence that seeds that are collected, say at a few degrees latitude and transitioned a bit farther north, generally we don't see too much of a decline in fitness. So fitness is growth, it could be survival, it could be any other thing. As we start to move seedlings quite a bit farther in terms of latitudinal transfer, we start to see that performance die off. So how much is the degree latitude? New Hampshire is about 3 degrees. So if we were to pick seeds from southern New Hampshire and bring them up to Hanover or points north, it's generally considered pretty safe in terms of latitudinal transfer. The second food group is assisted range expansion. This is the movement of populations to locations adjacent to the species range from areas that where the current climate is similar or projected to be suited in the future. So this is taking those species and making some modest movements outside of that current range. And so we actually have some examples of that, more for sustenance and other purposes. But many of our more satellite populations of red oak that we see in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine are actually largely attributed to Native American populations actively and passively moving mast and fruit trees. So we have some evidence of that being moved around in the past, but now in the context of climate change, can we take those sources and move them a bit farther north? So this is when we start to see a bit more conceptually, it becomes a bit, we don't have as much evidence to be able to track, is that possible to move a species, a source from its northernmost range and moving it a bit farther north? What we start to see is declines in that performance pretty quickly. Now remember, this is based off of historic climate, and that climate may actually have already advanced to the point where moving a species a few degrees north or a few 100 kilometers north may actually still maintain that overall performance. And then the last food group, and I think this is, I want to emphasize this one because this is, I think, where oftentimes folks go with assisted migration. The idea of assisted species migration. This is the translocation of exotic species. This is bringing plants from intercontinental transfers from various countries across our nation to be able to support and plants and to maintain some sort of ecosystem. Now we do have some examples of that. Norway spruce, folks may be familiar with. Red oak has been planted in Europe for quite some time and is now considered essentially native or not problematic. The problem is we really lack a lot of evidence of the practice of this. And so I would say that generally this is where we start to edge into some extreme cases and folks tend to be a little bit more wary of this. So when I talk about assisted migration, I generally refer to these first two food groups as those being a bit more palatable and realistic for forest operations. And when we're talking about the translocation of exotic species, while there is some evidence that there may be utility of that, I would generally advise to push away from them. And what we are seeing is that of those two food groups, the population enrichment and the range expansion, the Northeast may actually be quite a bit of a hotbed, or what we call a need. There may be a need for assisted migration in this region. And so on the left here, we see that generally many species may, there are a handful of species that may benefit from population enrichment. So this is collecting seeds and genotypes from southern seed zones and bringing them a bit farther north. And unfortunately, can't see it on this figure here, but take it from me, there are 10 to 20 different species that we expect to migrate into this region that are currently not present in the Northeast. And so the need to physically take those species and move them farther north may actually be a pressing need for forest operations. And so as a scientist, I'm oftentimes in the woods measuring growth and physiological performance, but we also have edged into social science, and we like to query how managers, natural resource managers, conservation commissions are perceiving the use of assisted migration. And so this is just some early results from a survey that we did, asking foresters, and these are foresters that are actively working in the climate change space and are thinking about modifying practices to be a bit more climate adaptive. So if they are interested in tree planting, what are their, what do they expect in terms of the future use of this? And overwhelmingly, 90% of them expect to use tree planting in the future, specifically for climate change. This is, Kevin will talk a little bit about, a little bit unusual. We don't actually plant a lot of trees in the Northeast. Our forests just sort of naturally can regenerate and can grow pretty well on their own, short of incorporating a new species or a regeneration target relative to, say, the south or the western parts of the U.S. where planting of trees is quite a big part of forest operations. And then within this group, we also find that the majority of them have either plans or are interested in using certain types of assisted migration. And those two food groups, the assisted population enrichment and the range expansion, those two groups that I talked about being a bit more palatable, foresters generally think that those are types of assisted migration that would incorporate. You'll just have to take it from me. This is the top of the bar. I don't know, you can't see it. Most of them do not plan to use assisted species migration, which would be the translocation of exotic species. So that was a bit assuring. Now we're starting to edge into some elements that we'll end up talking about, so I'll keep this quick. When it comes to actively practicing this, one of the challenges is that we really lack a lot of nursery capacity to be able to implement restoration targets, assisted migration, largely because, well, we don't plant a lot of trees in this region, and there haven't been a tremendous need to grow our nursery operation. So when we talk about buying seedlings, we're talking about buying tens of thousands of seedlings. This is not going down to the garden center and buying a few potted seedlings. And so oftentimes these are, if for a forest operation looking to plant seedlings, you're looking to well outside of the region. One of the things that we find is that overwhelmingly, most seedlings that are produced are just from a handful of species. 97% of them are conifers that are grown. And then regionally, this is the Northeast, we're really not producing an awful lot of seedlings. This really limits the access for this region to be able to engage in any sort of climate change adaptation planting. Now that's changing. Talk to the state of New Hampshire Nursery, and they've doubled their production every year. But the last thing I want to say is that what we found is when we take a bit of a deeper dive in where nurseries are actually collecting their seeds, this figure shows where our nurseries collecting the seeds for northern red oak. This is just the most commonly reproduced grown seedling in forest nurseries. And overwhelmingly, what we're finding is that the Northeast, we're really not collecting a lot of seeds to be able to grow in nursery operations. And this is attributed to it's a job that very few people are doing, is aging demographics, folks that are going out there and collecting those seeds. The records are pretty intermittent. And so for a conservation commission, a forester, a scientist who's looking to, say, plant for 100 years from now, finding a seed zone remains very challenging because we may not actually have the seed, let alone the seedlings, to be able to plant for. So at this point, I think we'll transition to Kevin. Or just keep it pressed forward. Yeah, I think it's just forward and backward.
I'm more comfortable in the woods. So, yeah, thanks for having me. I think that was a great introduction by Pete. And as always, I'm happy to come out of the woods. I love talking about forest and forestry. And I'm going to hopefully bring this back down maybe a smaller level and start talking about experiments that we're doing on our property, looking at assisted migration as a small part of adaptation management. So I think we have to look at things because, as Pete said, one of the things that we foresters are looking at and doing is we're managing land today, cutting it, doing silvicultural practices on it, and the trees that are there today may not be there in the future. So as we think about cutting and harvesting, foresters think in 20, 25 years when we come back in there. And how we cut today, we have to think about what's going to be there and how we're going to regenerate that into the future. And I think assisted forest migration and those kind of things are important. They're a tool in a very big toolbox of adaptation management. So we need to think about that. And so I think one of the points that Pete talked about that we need to be thinking about is that the tree species that are here today and the regeneration, they're not disappearing anytime soon. We think about, you know, he showed you red oak, he showed you hard maple, they grow way down into Tennessee and those kind of things. So they're not going to disappear that fast. So the management approaches that we think about need to start thinking about how we adapt our forest. And I think that whether it's a silvicultural practice that looks at species enrichment, trying to move that, that species a little bit farther up in its range, try to get red oak from the middle of New Hampshire up into the northern part, or some planting of species that aren't there is going to be important for us. So we're going to talk about, and this is our experiment at the Second College Grant. So we're going to travel north up towards the Canadian border and take a look. So in 2016, we were approached by the U.S. Forest Service and the University of Vermont about doing a adaptive climate study at the Second College Grant. We were one of the original 5 sites. Most of these sites are in specific habitats. So the Second College Grant was the habitat for northern hardwoods. So the neat thing about these experiments are they're co-produced. As I said, they're located all over the country. But the interesting thing is that they use local managers and scientists to design the experiment. And the one really important thing about these silvicultural experiments is that they be replicated. Lots of experiments over time have not been replicated. So this one is replicated. And the other thing we wanted to look at was to make sure it was operational. And so when we talk about that is we wanted enough acres where you could tell somebody it wasn't a 1 or 2 acre study. These are 25 acre blocks that you could actually go and show somebody elsewhere where to do it. So in 2016, we started our experiment. And one of the nice things that the Forest Service liked is that we've been cutting wood. We have harvested wood on the property since 1828, and we continue to do that, dominated by northern hardwoods. This is actually a group that spent 2 days on the grant, trying to come up with what we wanted our desired future conditions to be. We had managers from the U.S. Forest Service, state of Vermont, the college. We had scientists from UVM, Dartmouth, UNH, U.S. Forest Service, UVM, and Fish and Wildlife Service. And what we did is we adapted this silviculture approach to adaptation. So we're going to talk a little bit about our harvest. And so we did some stuff in resistance. And as we move along this continuum on the bottom, you see resistance is trying to maintain conditions that we have today. Resilience is trying to accommodate some degree of change, like Pete talked about. This would involve like some patch cuts and stuff where we're trying to get some of those intolerance back. The resistance would be much more tolerant. Moving over into transition where we're looking to stimulate change and facilitate that change. And tonight we're going to talk mostly about that transition harvest where we've actually done some assisted migration work in. This is our experiment laid out on the property. We have a north block and a south block, and we tried to look at aspect, different kinds of soils and stuff to replicate it on so we could start to see. This is actually a control block. So one of the things we added was a control block where we will not do anything. so that we can see how things progress, having done nothing. This is our transition cut here. You can see the yellow are clear cuts. The smaller yellow circles are smaller clear cuts. The red is actually reserves where we left trees unpainted. This is the resistance, and this is the resilience harvest. This is just some pictures of that transition harvest. So the upper corner here in the left is just kind of looking through what we call the matrix in between all of those harvests, trying to just have a good, nice mix of diameters and species in there. The picture down here at the bottom is the actual clear cut. We did 3 1-acre clear cuts with reserves. So a couple of those trees there are reserves. One of the things we thought about were species that, as Pete showed you those maps of species that we're going to keep their range. We started to think about those. The tree in the middle there is a disease-resistant beech tree. Very important for us because it's a carbohydrate, and that's the only one that we have. Up in the right-hand corner, one of the other things we're thinking about in climate change is ice. Lots of ice damage. We saw a lot of ice storms this year and rain. So we tried to mark as many of those wide tops out of there as we could, because as you can see, those have a tendency to break, and we wanted more of like a U-shaped top, so we were doing those. The tree on the bottom is dead and down. We actually dropped 2 to 3 trees per acre and just left them on the ground. And one of the reasons for that is we probably seen this winter 4-inch rainstorms. And the hydrologist that we were working with wanted to see that we could maybe stop some of that overland flow that's flowing down through there, disperse that out before it ran down the hill. So just a little bit about that. Here it is actually, as you can see, that pink down there is block number 2. And this is a drone shot of that. So these are the 1-acre clear cuts. This is a 10th acre clear cut, 1/4 acre clear cut. And we decided in this experiment that we would plant 2 of the 1-acre clear cuts and 2 of the 1/4 acre clear cuts in these transition zones. And we did that. We planted 400 seedlings in each one of the openings. And these are the 9 seedlings that we chose through this landowner, manager, scientist. It was an interesting back and forth about what some people thought, geez, why don't we plant black walnut, those kind of things. But as Pete talked about with the looking at those atlases about what trees are going to decrease or what trees are going to have no change or increase their habitat zone. We chose red spruce probably because, as Pete said, these things are very coarse. And on our ownership, probably red spruce has decreased more due to harvesting than it has due to maybe climate or that kind of stuff. So we felt like spruce was a good one to bank on, that it was going to be there. So we included that. We included eastern hemlock because we felt like our zone was cold and that we could maybe have it be a refugia for hemlock woolly adelgid. We might get cold enough temperatures where that would be a place where it would survive. So we added that. And I think the 2 ones that here, black cherry and red oak, they're in our area. And we just thought that we could probably increase them there. So we did plant those 6,500. Just wanted to quickly kind of reiterate this because it's going to become important when we start to talk about results. So Pete had the slide there, but I wanted us to take a look at it and just look at which ones of these are range expansion and which ones are population enrichment. So, white pine is in our forest, spruce. We do have some hemlock, and And black cherry, not at high numbers, but chestnut was definitely probably never there. So this is actually one of the quarter-acre cuts. This is year 2 after planting. So 50% of the trees were also caged to try to see if there was a difference between browse damage and trees without having something on them. 50% of the trees were also had some kind of annual competition control to see if there was a difference between the natives and the non-natives. These are our results after 6 years of planting. And you can see those species that are population expansion are doing pretty well. We're just kind of moving them a little bit, like Pete said. Hemlock, probably a little different story. You take a tree that usually comes in underneath shade and you stick it in the middle of a clear cut in a drought, doesn't like that. So I think that that's why we're seeing that. So our mean survival is about 50%. And you can see some of those trees are up in the 70, 75%. So we're still getting them out there. The range expansion trees, they're still living, but they're seeing other types of things. And we'll talk about big-tooth aspen and black cherry and why those are so low when we start talking about some of the challenges. So this is those clear cuts. You can't see it, but it's year 3. So one of the things you're fighting here is a thing Pete calls ecological memory. So those trees that are in the overstory, they want to survive. And so they have put seed out there for many years. So you've got this competition from seeds, from root suckers, from stump sprouts, all those things trying to grow back in here. And that's Mateus, he's about 6 foot tall. That's year 3 after harvest. This is year 5. There's some aspen root suckers that are now starting to get to be about 10, 15 feet high. But I did want to show you that red oak will survive and it will seem to grow pretty well. Although I think that that's Pete there, and I think that might be a seedling that had a little bit of competition control. Looks like it's opened up a little bit. And I believe, is it true, Pete, that that is a white pine weevil on a spruce? So you even have those kind of interactions coming in. So let's talk about some challenges, and we'll probably reiterate some of the things that Pete talked about. But one of the things is if you're planting a tree in southern Vermont and you want to think about where you need to get your seed for the climate in 2055, you have to go to Ohio. In 285, you got to go down maybe to West Virginia. And so I think that this then becomes important to look at some of our stuff. And the fact, Pete talked about nursery problems and those kind of things, limited amount of nursery stock. But if we look at the white pine and the red oak, which are doing well, most of that was collected in New Hampshire. And I think if we started to think about that, and we think about the climate in the grant today, it probably rivals what some of those trees are getting seed from were when they were young. So maybe we're not moving those seeds or having the genetic qualities of, maybe we should have been collecting it down around in Connecticut or Massachusetts. So, that's some of the stuff. I mean, our red spruce came from Nova Scotia. Maybe we would have liked it to come from, down along the Appalachians or something. So another challenge is trying to get that seed source for that climate for where you're moving it. Pete touched on some of these other things. Silviculturally here, we don't plant. We get back enough regeneration, you saw it. So planting is not a big thing for us. And so there's no skilled planters. We got a bunch of UVM kids with those brand new planting bars to go out there, and all I heard was ting, ting, ting. The terrain is rocky, rough, ledgy. You saw in some of those cuts, we didn't remove any of the slash. There was just slash everywhere. We said we would talk a little bit about that aspen and the black cherry. That's our refrigerator at the office. We didn't have a lot of refrigerator space, so when the seedlings came to us, we needed to find some place to put them. So put them in the fridge. The seedlings that came from Alpha Nursery were on a UPS truck for 3 days in 90-degree weather. And when I opened them up, they were moldy. They had already sprouted, and they didn't look very well. So it's not, I would say that that's probably one of the reasons they did not do very well. And the other thing for us too was we are now getting plantable times of the year very early. And we had to save our seedlings and keep them in cool storage for about 3 weeks before we could even get a pickup truck on our road to get them. Those are in about 6.5 miles in the woods where we planted them. So that's also a challenge. As I said, stock quality, you can see these are, out of one thing. This tree is kind of dead on the top. This one here is about, half the size of the others. If you were around Hanover this spring, you saw all kinds of frost damage. So we're getting frost damage on some of those species that were expanding their range. And moose are a real problem for us. And I would assume, like here in Hanover, deer browse are going to become a problem for us too. Deer are not a problem for us because we usually get 60 inches of snow. Here, you'll probably have that kind of a problem. The other thing, in 2018, when we decided to plant, we had one of the worst droughts that we've ever had. And so I remember the day we started planting, it was about 100 degrees in those clear cuts. And if you know anything about seedlings, taking them out of the bag for just a few seconds in the wind or the heat gets on them, that can kill a lot of those little roots. The second graph over there shows that we actually planted the second college grant, and then we planted 2 sites in Vermont. And we got, luckily, somebody did a rain dance, and we got rain within the first 5 days. Pete's other seedlings didn't get it for 15 days. And you can see there's a dramatic drop in survivability there just by not getting rain to come down at the right time. Some conclusions I think we've come up with so far. I think, as I said, assisted migration is going to be important in that box of adaptation tools for us foresters. We have to also think about, I think, lots of adaptive strategies to build on, because as we look at the last one, we're not going to plant ourselves out of climate change. The capacity isn't there, and people aren't going to be able to do that. But I think the takeaway message is that if 1 tree survives or 2, we now have hickory, oak, birch, and aspen on our ownership that wasn't there. They're going to produce seed at some time. They're going to start to disperse that out over our ownership. So we might be that far ahead as the climate changes. So doing a little bit of it may be that success story that we want. And some of them seem to be growing pretty well. And that's all I had.
All right, thank you. Let's sit down and take some questions. If you have thoughts, observations, questions, we want to receive them, let me know, signal me. As I was listening, I was just trying to, you kind of helped me in that last slide. I'm trying to figure out, like, does this work? Or are you experimenting to find out whether it works? And then you said it is a key tool in the toolbox, but while I was listening to you, I was like, is this like the wrench that's going to break? Or is this, is this a tool that works? And so I guess my takeaway is that it works, but I'm not sure.
I think it works. I think that a lot went into getting it to work. And I don't think yet, and Pete experimental things can be done because you have money. And if we start to think about, forestry and the fact that, we have to make a profit here, if we start to think about all the costs that went in to getting those trees to survive, I don't know if the cost-benefit ratio is there. But we need to start thinking about, we've got to have trees there in the future. So we've got to start figuring that out as an industry and those kind of things.
Yeah.
So it's an expensive tool.
Yes.
It's labor intensive. Seedlings are, a seedling's about a buck a seedling, $1 a seedling. And so you could plant a few seedlings and feel good, but a lot of times I say that we kill a lot of seedlings to be able to test the realities of it. Planting based off of a climate projection is really challenging because there's so many other factors that play into the performance and the ability for that seedling to survive. We talked about the stock quality, getting seedlings shipped in box trucks long distance, labor force. This was done by volunteers, and since then, that project we started 7 years ago, we do a handful of these every year. And we've gotten better, but there are a lot of other factors that act as filtering agents that limit the success, especially early on. So that really extreme drought that we had, which was a once in a century drought in the spring. Well, we've had a once in a century drought the last 5 years during planting season. And so that is another filter that makes just the simple act of planting seedlings really challenging. And so we're still teasing apart, are we planting for the right time frame, let alone can we actually plant seedlings and have them survive? So there's just the logistics relative to climate models is kind of hard to tease.
So is it the case that this is not a tool that we're really going to expect individual forest owners and thinking about people who own 5 acres, 20 acres, 25 acres of forest and want to manage it well with a view to conservation? Is this a tool that they can imagine using? Is it a tool that there are private equity funds here in town that own thousands of acres in New England? Is it a tool that and they want to at least pretend that they're, environmentally conscious? Maybe they do really want to be that way. Is it a tool they can use?
You want to start?
I think it's within the toolbox. I think that I would use it within a broad. Kevin talked about this idea of resistance, resilience, transition. These are just different ways of thinking of managing a forest for climate adaptation. So diversifying a forest might be a strategy. So that's so rather than having just one species, diversifying with native species and then simultaneously maybe augmenting with some system migration. Diversifying the complexity of the forest may also be a strategy. And so incorporating system migration as one of those aspects, I think is something that would be viable. But I would also emphasize that it should be placed against the other adaptation tools that we can also use.
Yeah, I think it's maybe a matter of scale. And I didn't put in, we have this great LiDAR image of some of these cuts and thinking about this tree growing up to produce seeds. And so if you get just one of those trees maybe growing on, you don't have to plant your whole ownership. But if you can take 2 or 3 of those cuts on your ownership, get them planted, get them established, then you've got the seeds to go out. So I think that that's where we have to start thinking of that assisted migration is little
That sounds
things
doable.
that we get out, and we do. We're not gonna, as I said, we're not gonna plant the whole forest in oak and hickory up there and have it an oak hickory forest for 285.
Yeah.
But we can push it that way.
I got a question from John. I got a question back here. Quick, I got to ask about my favorite species. White pine, I noticed it does pretty well. And the prognosis is good for the faithful old white pine, which I understand in this exact area was the dominant species when at least the Europeans got here in the 18th century. Are you hopeful about white pines?
I am. I think the growth has been great.
It's also the symbol of Dartmouth now. It's on all our stationery.
I think the climate models favor it. I think the challenges are the challenges that we don't know. So those are invasive pests and pathogens. And so there's recent evidence of some newer blights that are affecting pine that could be challenging in the future. But in terms of the climate models and its adaptability, it's generally viewed to be a species that should be.
All right.
So a couple of questions. One is, are forestry schools teaching this now as a tool that, foresters can have in their, 'cause I know some foresters are beginning to diversify more and not just cut trees, but really trying to help, with flow of water. I'm just asking that question about whether it's being taught at all in forestry schools or not.
I've been out of forestry school for a long time, so Pete may be able to answer that one.
So anecdotally, I mean, there's usually a lecture or two within like a forest health class. So yeah, it seems like at least in this region that I've been involved in and have been asked to speak on the topic. Interestingly, 7 years ago when we first started talking about this, outside of forestry school, talking to a forester, in my experience was that it was an unknown concept and it seemed, it seemed a little extreme. And now anecdotally, you go to a conference or talk to a forester and there seems to be quite a bit more awareness. Whether or not the uptake is there in a short amount of time, this is certainly a topic that folks are thinking about.
In a place where forests regrow on their own, you don't have to help them. In that kind of region especially, it seems like a radical, it's radical in a lot of different ways. I mean, even the idea of what counts as a native and what counts as invasive, we have to rethink.
Yeah, so
Second?
But this picture really says a lot because even if you get a couple of those, a few in there that, so a private landowner could actually do this on a smaller scale. And that would help the health of forests overall, because would start to spread. Is that correct? As those seedlings grow, they start.
Yeah, that's one way we think about it is that it can potentially be a future source node. So
even a few small acres, or if everybody did a few of those things, you'd be able to kind of.
And where should a landowner, what species should they look to first? Red oak?
I mean, I think they need to go to that, you need to get into that tree atlas, take a look at those. You can get on there and plan what you think you want to bring up, what's your climate going to be and those kind of things. And I'm going to also say that a lot of us managers in that co-management told Tony that none of these would survive.
Yeah.
And so I think we've learned a lot from that. And you saw 50% of the trees have survived. And so
you buried the lead. Because when I saw the 50%, I thought that was kind of a bummer, but you thought you expected zero.
You expected zero. I think it depends on what your perspective is. From an ecological perspective, maybe success. I think if you're a grant funder, You know, I think a lot of grant funding organizations mandate high levels of survival. If you're a production forester down south and you don't have 90% survival, that's failure. So it really depends on what your perspective is. But if we plant 1,000 hickory and we have a handful that are sexually mature and survive into the future, that may be what we deem success.
But you were surprised.
Yeah, I was, and I think it's that ecological memory, because
Yeah.
we saw how the regeneration is coming back. But for some reason, these things are surviving underneath that. Maybe they're just trainer trees or whatever. So yeah, I was pleasantly surprised.
And this hickory may be adapted to, it's not adapted to the climate of today, but that hickory may be adapted to 100 years from now. Now, can it get to that 100-year point or that 50-year point? You know, the seedling stage is the most delicate stage of the plant's life. But as those gaps become fully closed, natural successional processes occur, we're not in the clear 6 years in. But
Let's take a few more questions. Yes.
First of all, thanks for speaking and organizing this.
And really project so we hear the.
Yeah, as I think about this though, I'm asking myself, what problem are we trying to solve here? And it seems like, yeah, you can get a tree to grow in one of these habitats that's maybe not yet optimal. But are we trying to avoid some future suboptimal use of the site? Or are we trying to put species where they haven't gone before? To me, it seems like we're getting into very normative objectives here for management.
Good question. So what's the problem we're trying to solve? And
yeah, I think as habitats become less favorable for the forest that is currently here, again, those trees, I don't think we're going to see catastrophic losses of those trees, but it's like a 1-2 punch. They'll become more vulnerable to that system. They'll grow less. They'll be more susceptible to diseases, and at that point, you start to potentially start losing forest, or at least forest health and forest resilience. And so, as you potentially move past a tipping point the uncertainty is that forest still going to be there, or still going to give us the services that we need, whether that's wood products or wildlife habitat or clean air and clean water.
on the idea of the normative value that we have in mind, I mean, this is where the word conservation kind of shifts its meaning. We're looking to forest health rather than keeping the forest the same, or making it what it would be if humans didn't intervene. Is that right? We're trying to steward these forests with respect to forest health.
So rather than being focused on a species or a product or a singular objective, we're really focused on keeping forests as forests and keeping forests sustained. And so that may just be may need to be in a different state to be able to be maintained as a functioning forest.
Forest functioning. Is there a question from the online audience?
Yeah, we have a question online. Have there been any studies about soil mycorrhizae that might assist in the efforts of planting?
Did you hear that?
We did. And
could you repeat it one more? I didn't quite get it. What is it?
It's about mycorrhizae and some of the plantings. And I mean, we have looked at that, not on this particular site, but we have another site that we're doing some adaptive management on a piece of land the college owns in Corinth, looking at emerald ash borer. And there we are looking at those kind of things. And it's kind of way over my head and hard to understand it. But, you know, there's a reason that hardwoods grow here because of the mycorrhizae, and that is kind of transferred through small mammals and stuff. So the reason that, and if I get this wrong, Pete, tell me, that hardwoods grow here is because the seed coats break through some of the mycorrhizae fungi. And so that's why hardwoods will grow on this site. There are also mycorrhizal fungi that allow softwoods to generate and germinate. And so there's also a mix in these forests of different mice and voles and those kind of things that move that mycorrhizae around. And so why a pine grows well here or doesn't can have a lot to do with the mycorrhizae.
Do you have a question? I see a question.
I have a question. It sounded like you said that it would be good to get a seed from a plant that's growing in the south. So if there's a species that grows naturally in here and in Tennessee, would it be beneficial to go down to Tennessee and gather those seeds and then plant them here? Is that what you said? Somebody said.
Well, so.
How far south should we go?
Yeah,
We gather our
so it
seeds.
depends on what time frame you're thinking about and how extreme climate change you expect climate to change in terms of the emissions scenario. So
Well, I'm wondering which, I mean, if it's sugar maple and
Yeah.
it goes to Tennessee, are those that different, the ones that are naturally propagating themselves genetically?
so genetically, I mean, in terms of like what they're adapted to, I think you'll end up running into some problems if you're planting seedlings that are currently growing in Tennessee up here. We actually ran into this. Many of our American chestnuts are actually from a Virginia source, so pretty far south. We could talk about some of those problems, and that's a unique story, the American chestnut. But those southern species are probably going to be pretty far outside of their climate envelope, what they're capable of tolerating. Specifically, it would be winter cold entry would be really the main thing that I would think about. So yeah, Tennessee might be a little bit extreme, but parts of Connecticut, Pennsylvania, that might be.
So, spring break in Connecticut for you? Yes.
Yes, from a bigger picture and also from a scientific and even political, back, say, over the last 50 years, I took samples out of the Hubbard experiment station from the weir there, and the acidic levels were so low that it was kind of, has anything changed in the last 50 years in terms of pollution and causing effects on species diversity and what you would use for your samples, for instance. I've been out of the loop, so I'm just kind of trying to update myself.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're, if you look at like fir, red spruce, I think some of those are seeing not only climatic changes, but some of that, difference in pH. Spruce likes it, acidic. And so, as we lose some of that through weathering and that kind of stuff, probably affecting those trees.
Has it changed much in the last 50 years?
Yeah, I mean, things have gotten better because we're not getting all of that
That's my
stuff
question,
coming
yeah.
from the Midwest over us. So, as much as we talk about acid rain and those kind of things, clean air has done a lot with the way the air flows and comes over us. So we don't see as much acid rain as we used to get.
And that was part of the reason why we chose to include red spruce in our effort here. So if you look at the climate projections, red spruce is not expected to do well. But because we're seeing some new evidence that it's actually bouncing back and is growing in some pretty unique areas because of the Clean Air Act, that gives us some evidence to think that it may actually do a bit better. So Kevin talked about the tree atlas. It's a pretty useful tool just to get a sense of where species are expected to move into the future. So if folks are looking for tools to look into this, it's the climate change.
This is an online tool.
This is an online tool. You can look at species, be able to look at their projections under different time frames. You can also look at other factors that are affecting them. So maybe hemlock is expected to do well, but let's also remember that there's an invasive pest that's negatively affecting it. So there may be other compounding factors.
And Peter, I kind of picked it up from the slides, but Can you just remind us, give us what are a couple species, 2 or 3 species that you think are going to do well, so to speak, and what are 2 or 3 that are going to be very challenged or stressed?
Yeah, if I were to pick up just a few, red maple, folks tend to think it's going to do pretty well. A lot of the oak species, red oak particularly, but even white oak, maybe some chestnut oak would be unique. And then white pine, a lot of the pines tend to do pretty well. And then on the opposite end of that, sugar maple is sort of in between. It may not be a catastrophic loss, but it's not generally projected to do very well. It may do well in North Slope still in these colder refugia. A lot of the conifers, the spruce and the fir, are not expected to do super well. A big thing that we try to talk a little bit about is, as you think about incorporating assisted migration as a tool, think about like potential functional redundancy. So that's a scientific term, but American beech provides a really important carbohydrate-rich seed for wildlife.
Oh, that's what you were talking about, the carbohydrates. I was trying to figure that.
Yeah.
Bear like it.
I see. Oh, okay.
So if we lose that carbohydrate-rich food source for bear in this region, that will have a negative consequence on wildlife. And so potentially bringing in an oak or some other species that may be able to fill that role for them.
And do beech grow in the grant?
Yeah, that was one that you saw there, nice disease-resistant one. Yeah, we leave every
That's one that
disease-resistant.
grew on its own, you mean?
Yep, yeah.
Because they grow in the understory.
Actually, they'll grow up in the overstory. I mean, we have a lot of beech.
A lot of beech.
Bye.
Thank you.
We have a question here.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, can you both speak a little bit more to what you think would happen in a passive management scenario? So if you did nothing, I know that, and correct me if I'm wrong, red oak is projected to do really well here. It's here, so is white pine. So what if we did nothing? What will happen? And another question in my mind is, I know invasives are an issue. Is that part of the reason that you think this needs to be more actively managed to bring these species north?
Well, one of the things you saw in my experiment was reserves. So we've been thinking about that. So 20% of the resistance cut, the resilience cut is reserves, and those will always be reserves. So in that cut, we were thinking about that and thinking about keeping some of that forest untouched. And so even in the harvesting of the 25 acres we did, 20% of that we didn't touch and we will not touch ever. And so we've thought about that in our stuff. I mean, I think that from my standpoint and being a manager, we have looked at our ownership in the fact of trying to keep at least 10% of our land in some kind of no-cut, regime. So I think as we think about forest products and we think about all the things we need and use in the forest, we need to think about how we manage that other 80, 90%, so that we can have those products. And we then have that 10, 20%, whatever you decide, as your reserve area on your ownership too, because we want to see how things are going to react over time.
So Kevin, from your experience, or I guess your take would be, you're just experimenting to see what would be the best option, either assisted migration or not, really.
Yeah.
And then Peter, it seems like you're more advocate for it, so I'm curious a little bit more about why you think it's so important.
I think I wear multiple hats, and for this talk, I wear one that maybe comes across as a little more of an advocate of assisted migration. But I think within the context of this experiment, we're trying to create a continuum because what we're managing for is quite a bit of uncertainty. And so this experiment that we're describing, we're 6 years in, but this is a many decade-long experiment trying to understand how can, under different scenarios, we continue to maintain forests for the multiple services that we get. So red oak, white pine are here in Hanover, are projected to generally do well. But if you think about that climate shifting, I think it would be, the way I would think about those two species, which are largely projected to be winners, I would think about the genotypes that are currently here will be less adapted. So even though those species may generally do well overall, augmenting those with more southerly adapted seed sources of red oak, of white pine.
Maybe if I could just give one quick example. 20 years ago, wrote a management plan in Corinth, Vermont. Had some of the best white ash that I've ever managed in my life. My stands had over 40% of its growing stock in white ash.
Which is unheard of.
And today, I'm trying to figure out how to keep white ash on that ownership because of an invasive species that has come in and is taking it. So I think one of the things we're thinking about in adaptation is having all kinds of avenues, because we can't just have one or the other. Because there we had that, and now I'm having to switch 180 degrees and try to figure out how to keep that stuff. And if you think about the ecosystem underneath there, it's a unique ecosystem where ash is the last tree to leaf out. And so we have all these ephemerals underneath there, and we run the risk of losing all of these beautiful plants that are underneath there because we're going to lose that tree. 98% death in that overstory. And so what we did is we did another adaptive silviculture experiment over there using different cutting regimes to see which one might work to save some ash.
So we're going to have to wrap up the formal program. Thank you for that incisive question. It really, I think, helps wrap this up and drives home, in one sense, the results of this experiment by the time they come in, it'll be a little bit too late to really use those results in the management for this generation to use those results. And so we're flying a little bit blind here, but you've directed our attention, I think, to forest functioning and forest health, two topics that the Conservation Commission might pursue in greater depth in future programs in a way that's really illuminating. I have to say it's also, distressing. And so dealing with the adaptation is a very calm, term for something that is actually quite urgent and in a sense is a bit of an emergency. John, would you like to have a last word?
Just to final word, thank you so much. Actually, as a kind of sequel to this, we're actually going to do some of that in our town forest, hopefully, in the next, with coaching from these guys. Because it's also the question of resilience and biodiversity, right? That, if we're going to create resilience, you need different tools that you can use to create that resilience. So we're hoping we have a town forest near the side of Moose Mountain. We've got some clear cuts there that we're, so what I'm left with is if you plant 2 or 3 trees even, and they stay and they last and they add to that biodiversity of that area, that can be 50, 100 years from now. And we have to think that far ahead, obviously now from the way things are. So, but thank you so much for your attention.
Yeah, thanks.
For those of you here.